The most influential fashion figure of the 1990s was someone who genuinely did not care about fashion. That's the paradox at the center of this episode. Kurt Cobain wore flannel shirts because they were warm and cheap. He wore ripped jeans because the jeans ripped. He wore cardigans because he found them at thrift stores and they were comfortable. And within 18 months of Nevermind, every fashion house on earth was selling flannel shirts, ripped jeans, and cardigans for hundreds of dollars each. The accidental fashion genius. This is Style Breakdown, Kurt Cobain. Aberdeen, Washington. Population 17,000. Logging and fishing town on the Pacific coast. Perpetually grey. Perpetually wet. The flannel shirt was not a fashion choice in Aberdeen. It was the most practical garment for outdoor labor in a cold, wet climate. Loggers wore flannel. Fishermen wore flannel. Working-class Washington wore flannel. Kurt wore flannel because it was what you wore when you lived in Aberdeen and didn't have money. That's it. That's the entire origin story of the most imitated look of the decade. The flannel shirt. Let's break it down properly. Typically wool-cotton blend or cotton brushed on both sides. The brushing process raises the fibers, creating the soft nap that makes flannel warm. The plaid pattern, specifically tartan-adjacent plaids, became associated with logging because Pendleton woolen mills produced millions of them for exactly that market. When Kurt wore one, he was wearing a garment with a specific American working-class provenance. When Marc Jacobs sent flannel down the Perry Ellis runway in 1993, he was selling that provenance to people who wanted to borrow the authenticity without the Aberdeen winters. The cardigan. Cobain's most iconic garment. A thrift store find. Mohair adjacent, oversized, olive green. He wore it at the MTV Unplugged performance in November 1993. That performance, widely considered the greatest acoustic rock performance ever filmed, is also fashion history. Because the cardigan he wore became the single most sought-after piece of rock memorabilia in history. It sold at auction for over $300,000. A thrift store cardigan. For $300,000. That is fashion paradox at its most complete. The ripped jeans. Again, not a choice. A consequence. Jeans rip. Specifically at the knee, from kneeling on stages and crawling through venues. The hole appears. You don't have money for new jeans. The hole gets bigger. The look that every fashion house then sold as distressed denim, carefully engineered rips, sandblasted fabric, pre-stressed at the knee by factory machines, was originally just jeans that ripped because you couldn't afford new ones. Fashion's longest-running lie is that worn equals chosen. For Kurt, worn was just worn. The fashion industry then sold worn for a premium. That gap between reality and product is the entire story of grunge fashion. 1993, Kurt Cobain starts wearing thrift store women's dresses on stage. Floral patterns. Babydoll cuts. Sometimes with combat boots. Sometimes with Converse. The music press was confused. Fans were confused. But Kurt was very clear about his intention. He wore dresses to make his male audience uncomfortable, specifically the homophobic contingent that he felt had been drawn to Nirvana's heaviness without understanding its values. The dress was a filter. If the dress made you leave, you were the audience he didn't want. Fashion used as audience curation. The most brilliant use of clothing as message control in rock history. The Converse Chuck Taylor All-Star. Kurt's shoe. Permanently. Black canvas, rubber sole, ankle height, worn without lacing them properly. The Chuck Taylor had been around since 1917, originally a basketball shoe, then adopted by everyone who couldn't afford better. By the 1980s they cost $12. Kurt wore them because they were $12. But the visual effect was important. Converse read as anti-fashion, anti-status. You don't wear Converse to impress anyone. That negation of status signaling was itself a powerful status signal. I don't care what you think of my shoes is its own kind of statement. The Marc Jacobs Perry Ellis Collection, Spring 1993. The most important fashion show of the decade. Jacobs sent grunge down the runway: flannel, ripped denim, thermal undershirts, oversized cardigans, work boots. The fashion industry was appalled. Women's Wear Daily called it a big mistake. Marc Jacobs was fired from Perry Ellis within months. And then, gradually, the entire industry realized he'd been completely right. That show defined the visual decade. Every luxury brand produced a grunge collection after it. The man who was fired for seeing the future correctly built one of the most successful fashion houses on earth. Kurt Cobain was ambivalent about fashion attention at best. Hostile to it at worst. He watched his look get commodified in real time and found it genuinely disturbing. But here's what fashion history shows us: the most authentic looks become the most copied precisely because they can't be faked in the same way. You can manufacture distressed denim. You can manufacture flannel. You cannot manufacture Aberdeen. You cannot manufacture growing up without money in a logging town in the Pacific Northwest. The look exists. The reality behind it doesn't transfer. Which is why every grunge revival since 1994 has looked like costume. And Kurt's original still looks like truth. What did Kurt Cobain change in fashion? He made not trying a valid aesthetic position. He democratized rock fashion. Suddenly you didn't need to be extravagant or theatrical. You could look like you just rolled out of bed and that was enough. He proved that authenticity, genuine, unperformed, accidental, is more powerful than any designed look. He accidentally created a multi-billion-dollar fashion segment that still exists. Athleisure, normcore, quiet luxury all descended from the idea that not trying can be its own sophisticated statement. That style breakdown, Kurt Cobain. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Next episode, Tupac Shakur: How a Marin City Kid Became the Style Architect of an Era.